Welcome to the Tipping Point program. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a little bit more about Ezekiel 38 and 39, this a very important prophecy that we see the stage being set for today. And in our subscriber portion, I want to answer some questions as well as respond to the news about some different technological developments, especially related to central bank digital currencies. So be sure and join us for that part of the program. Well, I want to talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39. This is are two chapters that are very important today, I think, as we see the prophetic landscape developing in our world. We've talked about this a lot. I know Jimmy Evans has talked about it a lot. Greg Laurie's talked about it a lot. It's very important, obviously, in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I want to revisit this because there are a lot of developments just in the last couple of weeks that I think, again, are foreshadows of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, a lot of you probably know a great deal about these two chapters. Some of you may not know very much. So let me just go back and just give a little bit of context, and so that the things I say about current events will make even more sense and have more impact. Ezekiel 38 and 39 are in this last section of the book of Ezekiel, this restoration section of the book. Ezekiel in chapters 1 to 24 has been giving the judgment against Judah back in that day. The Babylonians are going to come and take them into captivity. In chapters 25 to 32, he talks about God's judgment on the near nations around Judah in the time of the Babylonians. But in chapter 33, Ezekiel in Babylon gets news that Jerusalem has been destroyed and has been taken. And so from that point on in the book, he begins to look to the distant future, to the ultimate restoration of the Jewish people to their homeland. And chapter 37 of Ezekiel is one of the great chapters in the Bible about the final restoration of the Jewish people to their land right before the end times unfold. It's the great chapter about the dry bones. And again, I think we're seeing today the partial fulfillment or the progressive fulfillment of Ezekiel 37 as the Jewish people just continue to come back to their land. And again, this is the most important prophecy because it sets the stage for these other prophecies to be fulfilled. Because obviously when we get to Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is a Russian Islamic invasion of Israel, well, Israel can't be invaded if the Jewish people aren't there. So that's the first precondition, is Israel being back in their land. And then Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog." Now Gog is the leader of this coming invasion. The word Gog, we're not sure what it means. It may mean high or exalted. It may mean darkness. But Gog will be the leader of this invasion. And again, if this invasion occurs within the next decade or two, certainly Vladimir Putin could be Gog. We don't know. But as I've mentioned before, Joel Rosenberg says he certainly is Gog-esque. He's Gog of the land of Magog, which Magog is the southern part of Russia, may include Ukraine. The prince of Rosh, which I believe Rosh there is Russia. Then Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against him. Meshech and Tubal are in modern-day Turkey, the central part of Turkey. And say, "Thus says the Lord God, I'm against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you about, put hooks in your jaws, I'll bring you out. All the army, horses, horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company with buckler, shield, all of them wielding swords. Persia," that's Iran. The name was changed from Persia to Iran in 1935, and now it's known as the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ethiopia, that's Cush. In ancient Hebrew, that's the land south of Egypt. It's modern Sudan. And then Put was the land west of Egypt. It's modern-day Libya. All of them with shield and helmet. Gomer, with all its troops. Gomer is also in modern-day Turkey. Beth Togarmah. Beth Togarmah, the house of Togarmah, is in the eastern part of modern-day Turkey. Notice from the remote parts of the north, with all its troops, many peoples with you. So these nations mentioned here, kind of the outer ring of nations of Israel's enemies. It could include nations within that, but at least these specific nations here are part of this invasion of Israel. And what's happening right now, Russia and Iran and Turkey are meeting in Iran. And I call these nations really the triple threat. This is the terrible trio here in the Gog-Magog prophecy. This is the triumvirate of evil. You have Russia, which is here Rosh and Magog. You have Iran, which is Persia, and you have Turkey, which is Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. So 7 of the 10 proper names mentioned here in Ezekiel 38 encompass what we know today as Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And so they're meeting right now as I speak in Tehran. Turkey's President Recep Erdogan will be there to meet with Vladimir Putin of Russia. Now, what we've seen in Ukraine is very consistent with what the Bible says about Gog of the land of Magog in the end times. This aggressive behavior, this expansionist behavior, taking a neighboring country. Many believe that Putin, if he's able to take Ukraine, which it seems to me like he will just over time, just a long, drawn-out, grinding, just withering campaign. Some say he may try to move into Moldova or some of the other nations there that are not part of NATO. But we've seen that happening. We've all talked a lot about how that's a setup or a foreshadow of what Ezekiel in 38 and 39 predicts. But when you see Russia and Iran and Turkey all meeting in Tehran, this should send off the red flashing signals about the gathering of this Gog coalition. All 3 of these nations, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, are also very involved in Syria. That's going to be a lot of what they're going to talk about there is their involvement in Syria, which obviously is right on the northern border of Israel. Vladimir Putin, this is his first visit since the Ukraine invasion happened. It's his first visit to a foreign country in a long period of time. You know from Jimmy Evans' report last week that Russia is seeking surveillance as well as armed drones from Iran. So again, the ties between these nations are just being cemented more and more. Vladimir Putin, while he's there, is going to meet with the Iranian Ayatollah, who's the real power of the nation. The president there is a man named Raisi. So you have President Raisi, you have Vladimir Putin, and then you have Erdogan, who's the leader of Turkey. But Vladimir Putin's going to meet with the Iranian Ayatollah Khamenei. And just this week as well, Iran themselves have come out and said that they're able now to produce a nuclear weapon. So all of this is happening here at the same time. And this is really what I would call, the Gog coalition that we see primarily coming together. Because the other nations mentioned here, nations like Put or Libya and Ethiopia, which is Kush, which is Sudan, these are kind of smaller players really within this Gog coalition. The main triple threat here is Russia, it's Iran, and it's Turkey. These are these 3 key players that are coming together. On July the 19th, again, which is today, as I'm speaking this video, there's going to be the 7th meeting of the top-level Turkish-Iranian Cooperation Council. So they're meeting for the 7th time. This is a top-level meeting called the Turkish-Iranian Cooperation Council. So Turkey, Iran, Russia, these 3 nations meeting together with this Gog coalition. Now, I want to just make one comment here. There's something else I want to talk about related to current events that's very important that's developing. But I want to talk about something else for a moment, and that is, when is this Gog-Magog invasion going to take place? It tells us, look, Israel's going to be regathered to their land in the end times. At some point in time when Israel's regathered, these nations led by Russia, Iran, and Turkey are going to invade Israel. They're going to come to wipe Israel out. Bible prophecy teachers disagree greatly on the timing of this invasion. In fact, there's been 6 different time periods within the end times that this invasion has been placed, all the way from before the rapture to the end of the millennial reign of Jesus. Again, I won't have time in this video to go into all the different reasons, but I've mentioned this before, but I just want to say this again because I think it's important in this context to say that I think this will happen during the first half of the coming 7-year tribulation period. Many others believe it'll happen before the tribulation, maybe before the rapture, and certainly that's possible. But we have a couple of clues, a couple of chronological clues in Ezekiel 38. It tells us that when this invasion happens, obviously the main precondition is Israel's back in their land. They're living securely in their land. So the precondition, first one is they're there. The second one is, it says they're living prosperously. They're prospering greatly. Well, that's been fulfilled as well. Israel's a prosperous nation. But the third precondition is it says they're going to be at rest and they're going to be living securely. Now, some would say, well, Israel's at rest and secure today. I was just over there 2 years ago. You go to Israel, you feel very safe there. We plan on taking a group there next March, Lord willing. So we go there because we consider it to be a safe place. But when it says here in Ezekiel that they're going to be at rest and living securely, I would say that the Jewish people today in Israel are hardly at rest. I mean, they're on high alert constantly with the enemies that surround them, especially Hezbollah in the north and Hamas and the threats they're receiving from Iran. So it seems to me that this invasion will occur while Israel has their guaranteed peace from the Antichrist. The event that starts the 7-year tribulation is the Antichrist makes a peace treaty with Israel, some kind of guaranteed safety for them. It evidently allows them to either rebuild their temple or to offer sacrifices there on that Temple Mount. So it seems to me that fits best when Israel's at rest and living securely. That's when this invasion will take place. Now, again, many people would say it's going to happen even before the rapture. It could happen any time, which would make what I'm talking about here today even more urgent or imminent. But I see more stage setting that will take place. The rapture will occur. When the rapture occurs, the Antichrist will come on the world scene as the great peacemaker. He'll broker this treaty with Israel, the 7-year treaty. And sometime during that first half of that 3.5 years of this guaranteed peace, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and these other nations will come down into Israel. And it'll be an attack on Israel, but at the same time, it will also be an attack on the Antichrist and these Western powers because they're going to be in treaty with Israel. So it's going to be a subtle attack on them as well. And of course, you can go on and read Ezekiel 38 and 39 and find out how these armies, when they invade Israel, are going to be supernaturally wiped out by God. Well, back to the current events now. We see that the God coalition and how it's being cemented together more and more every day with Russia, Iran, and Turkey. But further on in Ezekiel 38, down in verse 13, we find out about another coalition of nations. Now, these nations are not the attackers. We could call them the objectors. There's a group of nations listed here that object to this Russian, Iranian, Turkish alliance invading Israel. Down in verse 13 of Ezekiel 38, it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages will say to you, that is, they'll say to Gog, to Russia and these nations invading Israel, have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to capture a great spoil? So there's going to be 3 different groupings that are mentioned here, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish. They're going to say to Gog, are you coming to capture spoil? Are you coming to take away cattle and goods? So they don't get involved. They stay on the sidelines, but nevertheless, they're giving what I refer to as kind of a lame protest to what's taking place. So we have Sheba, we have Dedan, and we have these young lions of Tarshish. Now, if you read the Old Testament, Sheba is mentioned a little bit over 30 times in the Old Testament. It's Sheba. Sometimes people will say that the word Sabaean also refers to those from Sheba. Probably the most common reference you may think of in your mind is, remember the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba came to visit King Solomon and see his great wealth and hear his wisdom. But Sheba is the area of southern Arabia. It includes Saudi Arabia. It may also include Yemen, which obviously is a place of great turmoil today, with a lot of terrorist activity taking place in Yemen. But Sheba is fairly easy to identify. And Sheba is mentioned several times, 3 times in the book of Ezekiel. This is just one of them here. But the next nation mentioned is Dedan. Dedan's mentioned about 11 times in the Old Testament, mentioned 4 times in the book of Ezekiel. And again, Dedan, most scholars would say today, are the nations on the northwest coast of the Persian Gulf. So today, we refer to those as kind of the moderate Gulf states, kind of like Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and those very Oman, some of the Qatar, some of these kind of more moderate Gulf states that are there, that, by the way, are in great conflict and very afraid of Iran. And then it mentions the merchants of Tarshish. And again, that's a little bit harder to identify, the merchants of Tarshish. Notice it says with all of its villages, or some translations say, and the young lions thereof. So we have this Gog coalition, primarily Russia, Iran, Turkey, that we see coming together. But I believe today as well, we see what we might call the Sheba coalition, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish coming together as well. Let me read just something for you. I've got a book I wrote a few years ago called Russia Rising. It's a book that's all about Ezekiel 38, 39, Gog, Magog. Let me just read what I wrote in here, a couple of thoughts that may be helpful to help you understand this better. It says the opposition here is described in Ezekiel 38:13 as Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish. And it says, notice here that these nations don't do anything. They just question what's happening. So they're not active in this. They're just on the sidelines giving a protest. Their mild protest doesn't change anything. They question the motivation and purpose of the invasion. And I say here, this looks frighteningly similar to the passive reaction we often see from the United Nations and nations in the West to international aggression. They kind of say, what are you doing? And they kind of give a protest to it, but they don't really take any real solid action. Three specific places are listed as the source of the opposition: Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish. Sheba and Dedan are easy to identify. They refer to nations on the Arabian Peninsula and along the Persian Gulf. Walter Kaiser, some of you may know that name. He's a great Old Testament scholar. He says that Sheba and Dedan are usually identified with people living in the Arabian Peninsula, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. And again, most of these nations, as you probably know, are under moderate Sunni Arab regimes who oppose the more militant strains of Islam, especially the radical Shiite Islam that's found currently in Iran. Now, Tarshish is a little bit more difficult to identify with precision. The identification is complicated by the mention of all the villages. That's what the New American Standard translates it. Tarshish and all the villages, or the King James says, and all the young lions. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who's another Old Testament scholar, he says the phrase is a Hebrew idiom meaning nations that have come out of Tarshish. So Tarshish and the young lions thereof, or Tarshish and its villages, would be the nations that came out of Tarshish. Now, to complicate this even further, two places in the ancient world are identified as Tarshish: Spain and England. If Tarshish is Spain, the nations that came from it obviously would include a lot of Central and South America, except for Brazil, these nations that were formed through Spanish colonization. If the location of Tarshish is England, it would include the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the nations that came out of England. The name Tarshish, though, is used in ancient times to just denote the farthest place to the west. So it's probably best, I think, to identify Tarshish with the western nations of Europe, possibly even the United States. Remember when Jonah was supposed to go to Nineveh, he fled to Tarshish, which was a Phoenician colony on the coast of Spain. In other words, it was as far west as you could go. Now, some people say, well, the farthest west you could go in that day would have been places even like the United States. And they'll see Tarshish and the young lions thereof as an identification of the U.S. And they'll say, look, this is the United States and Saudi Arabia and these moderate Gulf states that we see in relationship today. That's certainly possible. But what I would say is any identification here of the young lions of Tarshish with America is tenuous, I think, at best. So I think it's just referring here to these Western powers. But what's interesting to me is if you look at what's happening in our world today in this light, Haaretz, which is a Israeli periodical headline that says how Israel and Saudi Arabia plan to down Iranian drones together. Again, this is something unthinkable in the past. Saudi Arabia didn't even recognize Israel's right to exist. But it says the establishment of a joint aerial defense system for Israel and Gulf states against Iranian missiles and drones is on Biden's agenda visiting the region this week. And it goes on to say in this article, the Regional Defense Alliance that Defense Minister Benny Gantz and other politicians have been talking up in recent weeks. They've dubbed it MEAD, M-E-A-D, which is Middle East Air Defense. So what we see happening before our eyes is the same time that the God coalition is coalescing, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, we also see what we might call the Sheba coalition or the Tarshish coalition coming together as well, where you have Saudi Arabia, these more moderate Gulf states, entering into friendly relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords, and now what we see in the growing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And again, these Western powers, probably designated here by Tarshish, that are behind all this as well, with NATO and the EU and these other nations, and possibly the United States being included in this as well. So you see both sides really, or both of these coalitions coming together, the attackers, the attacking nations, but also the nations